the United States have worked hard to build the country we enjoy today. But the road to our success hasn't always been easy. We fought to gain our independence from Great Britain, have been drawn into battle in 2 world wars, and have suffered through times of great economic hardship. The decade from 1929 through 1939 was the worst period of economic crisis in United States history. This period is known as the Great Depression. When the Great Depression struck, it didn't stop at the borders of the United States. Indeed, the whole world was affected. But let's go back to the beginning. To understand the Great Depression, it is important to understand what came before it. The Roaring Twenties. After the end of World War I in 1918, the United States entered an era of great political and social change. This period of time is often called the Roaring Twenties. Life was good. The world was at peace, and people were making money because the economy of the United States was growing and strong. It was an exciting time to be alive. Technology like electricity, radios, and telephone lines were linking people together, making them feel more connected than ever before. Another big change was where Americans were choosing to live. Large numbers of people were moving to the cities. By the end of the 1920s, for the first time in United States history, more people were living in cities than in rural areas. American cities became bustling centers for business and the arts. The growth of cities and a new connection between people all across the country allowed for the growth of mass culture. New technologies led to a surge in consumer goods like household appliances. Companies began building factories and hiring workers to make these new products. American workers now had more money to spend on these newly available products. Products like ready-to-wear clothing, washing machines, and, most exciting of all, automobiles were sweeping the nation. Many people in the United States believed that life was great and could only get better. Let's review what we have learned about life in the U.S. during the 1920s. Question 1. The 1920s in the United States is known by what nickname? A. The Age of Electricity. B. The Roaring Twenties. C. The Factory Era. D. The Dawn of Consumers. If you answered B, you know that the 1920s is sometimes called the Roaring Twenties. Question 2. Which of the following is true about U.S. citizens of the 1920s? A. More people were living in cities. B. More people began operating farms. C. People were suspicious of new technology. D. None of the above. The correct answer is A. During the 1920s, more people were living in cities. Question 3. Which of the following was a new product in the 1920s? A. Automobiles. B. Electric washing machines. C. Ready-to-wear clothing. D. All of the above. The correct answer is D. Cars, ready-to-wear clothes, and electric washing machines were new products in the 1920s. The beginning of the Great Depression. During the 1920s, banks made it easy for people to borrow money to buy all of the new and exciting consumer goods that were being produced. Banks were also lending consumers money to invest in the stock market. Stocks allowed investors to buy shares of a business. Owning a share of a company is like owning a small part of that company. If the company continues to do well financially, the price of its shares rise. If the company doesn't do well, prices fall. Investors can sell their shares at any time. They receive whatever price the shares are worth at the moment of sale. During the economic boom of the 20s, many people invested their savings in the stock market. Stock prices for many companies continued to rise during the 20s, so investors made money and continued to buy stocks. The stock market underwent a period of tremendous growth, reaching its peak in August of 1929. While times were good for some people in urban areas during the 1920s, farmers in the United States were struggling. During World War I, farmers had purchased expensive equipment like tractors and harvesters to make farming less labor intensive. This allowed them to grow more crops. The U.S. government paid farmers for these crops and used the food to feed U.S. soldiers. After the war, the government no longer needed all of this food. So farmers were faced with a crop surplus, which caused the prices to drop dramatically. Farmers struggled to keep their farms running. By 1929, economic trouble was beginning to brew back in the cities as well. Stock prices had continued to rise, but on Thursday, October 24th, 1929, the stock market began to crash. Stock prices began to fall on that day and kept falling all day. Suddenly, many investors wanted to sell their stocks, which made even more people want to sell their stocks. Stock prices dropped dramatically. By Tuesday, October 29th, or Black Tuesday, as it was called, panic had overtaken the stock market. Almost 16 million stocks were traded that day, more than had ever been traded before. Millions of stocks ended up being worthless. People who had borrowed money from the bank to buy stocks were financially ruined or found themselves heavily in debt. After the crash of the stock market, many realized that for some time their belief in the strength of the market had not been based in reality. Panic began to set in. Let's review what we have learned about the beginning of the Great Depression. Question 1. A share in the ownership of a company is called what? A. An annual report. B. Profit. C. A stock. D. A balance sheet. If you answered C, you know that a stock is a share in the ownership of a company. Question 2. During what month in 1929 did the stock market reach its peak? A. May. B. June. C. July. D. August. The correct answer is D. In 1929, the stock market reached its peak in August. Question 3. Tuesday, October 29th, 1929 is also known by what nickname? A. Black Tuesday. B. Crash Tuesday. C. Panic Day. D. Financial Plunge. If you answered A, you know that Tuesday, October 29th, 1929 is known as Black Tuesday. Bank runs. The stock market wasn't the only part of the economy in trouble. Banks were in crisis too. Many banks had loaned customers money to buy stocks that were now worthless. Now these customers couldn't pay the banks back. Customers had also borrowed money to buy cars and washing machines. These loans couldn't be paid back either. Fear was sweeping the nation. People began to worry that the banks were losing all of their money because of these bad loans. Again, a sense of panic set in. Account holders rushed to banks to withdraw their money in what became known as bank runs. Banks ran out of cash, and many were forced to go out of business. At the time, there were no government regulations that protected a consumer's money once it was deposited in a bank. People's fortunes evaporated, and their debt increased. Now people no longer had money to buy consumer goods. These factories that made radios and automobiles went out of business. Companies that could stay in business had to cut their production dramatically. As a result, people lost their jobs and the unemployment rate skyrocketed. By 1932, 1 out of every 4 Americans was completely out of work. For many people, life during this time was bleak. People were forced to live in makeshift shanty villages after losing their homes. Charity-run soup kitchens and bread lines provided the only food many would eat each day. Many people were hungry or starving. Meanwhile, on the farms, farmers were growing food that they couldn't afford to harvest or get to market. Sadly, fields of wheat were allowed to rot, and cow's milk was thrown away. What did the United States government do to help its citizens during this crisis? President Herbert Hoover had been in office only 8 months when the stock market crashed in the fall of 1929. Once the Great Depression took hold of the country, Hoover made it clear that he believed that the government should not give money directly to its citizens. Instead, he believed government should provide guidance to charitable organizations like the Red Cross to help people in need. But charitable organizations alone could not feed and house the many Americans in distress during the Great Depression, and the suffering continued. When Americans headed to the polls in November of 1932, they were ready for a change. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, also known as FDR, won a landslide victory and became the next president of the United States. FDR had a different vision of the role of government. He believed that government should help everyone who needed it. FDR had a calm confidence in the ability of the American people to work together to solve the nation's deep problems. He declared, "I pledge to you, I pledge to myself, a new deal for the American people." The American people were certainly ready for a new deal. Let's review what we have learned about life at the beginning of the Great Depression. Question 1. The rush of people to withdraw money from banks in 1929 was known as what? A. Bad loans. B. Bank runs. C. Economic loss. D. Profit drain. The correct answer is B. The rush of people to withdraw money from their bank accounts in 1929 was known as bank runs. Question 2. By 1932, how many Americans were out of work? A. 10%. B. 25%. C. 55%. D. 80%. If you answered B, you know that 25% of American workers were out of work in 1932. Question 3. Which U.S. president was elected in 1932, pledging a New Deal for the American people? A. Herbert Hoover. B. James Garfield. C. Woodrow Wilson. D. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. If you answered D, you know that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected U.S. president in 1932. The end of the Great Depression. During the very first days of his administration, FDR took immediate steps to correct the nation's economic crisis. One of his first actions was to declare a 4-day national bank holiday to allow federal inspectors to look at each bank to see if it had enough money to stay in business. He also asked Congress to create laws that would help consumers, as well as banks and other financial institutions. This was the beginning of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation insured depositors against the loss of up to $5,000 of their deposits if their bank should collapse. This agency is still in existence today. FDR's administration passed many pieces of legislation and created programs and agencies as part of his New Deal. They focused on 3 areas: relief, recovery, and reform. The first goal was to provide aid to the suffering. FDR called for the creation of programs like the CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps. The CCC put people back to work by creating jobs for men building roads and developing national parks. FDR also created the Federal Emergency Relief Agency, or FERA, which offered job training programs and devised ways for farmers to get their unused crops to people in need of food. By the spring of 1933, the U.S. economy was showing some signs of recovery. However, many people were still without jobs and were still suffering terribly. FDR and his administration then launched a second wave of programs, sometimes called the Second New Deal. The National Recovery Administration was created and promoted policies like limiting the number of working hours in a day and the establishment of a minimum wage. Other programs aimed at recovery included the Tennessee Valley Authority, which built dams to control flooding and brought electricity to poverty-stricken areas along the Tennessee River, and the WPA, or Works Progress Administration, which helped to provide jobs for 8.5 million people from 1935 to 1943. The third piece of the New Deal was reform. The goal was to ensure that this type of prolonged and drastic economic crisis could never happen again. New legislation, like the National Labor Relations Act, was passed to ensure businesses treated workers fairly. The Social Security Act of 1935 was one of FDR's most important and expensive New Deal programs. It provided social safety nets in the form of a national pension fund, an unemployment insurance system, and federal aid program for dependent children and people who are disabled. In November of 1940, FDR was elected to a third term as U.S. president. A constitutional amendment limiting a U.S. president to 2 terms would not be ratified for another 11 years. Although conditions in the United States were improving, the Great Depression was far from over. Meanwhile, in 1939, World War II had begun in Europe. Roosevelt promised that he would do everything he could to keep the United States out of the war. However, on December 7, 1941, Japanese forces bombed Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The United States was forced to declare war. With the U.S. at war, more workers were needed for a variety of men enlisted in the armed services. Other people went to work manufacturing the airplanes, ships, and weapons the U.S. needed to fight against Germany and the other Axis powers. The Brooklyn Navy Yard hired more than 70,000 workers to build ships. As men went off to war, women had new opportunities for work. Just as there was no one single cause of the Great Depression, it was likely the combination of FDR's New Deal and the need for workers at the start of World War II that brought this period of economic crisis to an end. FDR's New Deal policies have had a profound and lasting impact on life in the United States. Much of our infrastructure, including roads, bridges, water lines, schools, and libraries, were built as part of the New Deal. This allowed the economy of the U.S. to grow and strengthen. Programs like the FDIC continue to allow people to be confident that money is safe in U.S. banks, and stock market regulations protect consumers by requiring companies to be truthful about profits. The Great Depression left a lasting legacy on the government and the people of the United States. Let's review what we have learned about the end of the Great Depression. Question 1. What did FDR do to quickly stabilize the U.S. banking industry? A. Set daily limits on bank withdrawals. B. Established a banking commission. C. Declared a 4-day bank holiday. D. All of the above. The correct answer is C. FDR declared a bank holiday to put a plan in place to stabilize U.S. banks. Question 2. Which law established a type of national pension fund for U.S. workers? A. The Social Security Act of 1935. B. Federal Emergency Relief Act. C. Agricultural Adjustment Act. D. Federal Securities Act. If you answered A, you know that the Social Security Act of 1935 established a type of national pension fund. Question 3. What major event is thought to have helped to bring an end to the Great Depression? A. The invention of the telephone. B. The establishment of the United Nations. C. The United States entered World War II. D. FDR was elected to his 4th term as President of the United States. The correct answer is C. Historians believe that the United States' involvement in World War II helped to bring an end to the Great Depression. Thinking question. Could a Great Depression happen again in the United States? Explain your thinking.